Hello, and welcome to the Product Launch Do's and Don'ts podcast, another exciting episode in our product launch series. Hear from Lynn Donaldson, recognized for having great success working with product launch teams in the pharmaceutical and medical devices industry, as well as her all-star cast of experts in their industry, as they come together to answer your questions and outline how to have a successful product launch. Listen to Lynn and the experts share their knowledge and expertise from their real-life examples to ensure your success. So if this is your first product launch, or if you've launched products in the past, you're sure to find great value.
Welcome. I'm Lynn Donaldson from Connect Strategic Solutions Group. Our focus is on helping mid-sized pharmaceutical and medical device companies to launch their valuable products for patients so that their treatment choices and needs can be met. Over the next couple of months, we will interview experts from various functions that will be integral to the launch of these valuable products. Ultimately, benchmarking is our end goal. How do we define and achieve success? The objectives for the podcast are: discover what drives a successful product launch from our experts, provide podcast participants, i.e. the next generation or the current generation, with material that will trigger ideas, and potentially identify innovations to advance the industry as a whole. We will not share proprietary information. We will speak in generalities based on our experience. This podcast features a guest who brings the perspective to product launch from global, regional, and local commercial role. He worked for 15 years in a large pharma company, followed by a decade in biotech. Joerg has been involved in many primary care as well as specialty products in roles ranging from local product manager, regional operational director, global team leader to country manager. And during his time, he has learned much about successful launches and missed opportunities. So thank you so much for taking the time today to speak with us. It's an honor to have you on the podcast. I am looking forward to hearing your insights into the launching of a new product in the life science field.
Thank you, Lynn. Certainly a pleasure being here, and I hope I can provide some of my insights, and more importantly, maybe some people can build on those and benefit from some of the past experience and lead to their success, but also at the same time, hopefully prepare for some of the unexpected and avoid some of the learnings that I had over the last 20, 25 years. Thank you.
You're most welcome. And I know it was a little while ago that we worked together, but it's lovely to see you here again. So let's get started with the questions, because I'd really love to hear what you have to say, and so would our listeners. So are you in the pharmaceutical or medical devices industry?
Yes. So I spent 15 years at a large pharma company, mostly in the primary care sector. And I started out with that company in Germany in the commercial area, then transitioned to their US organization, eventually ended up in their global organization for 15 years in that large pharma. And I had the fortune at the very end to be in a specialty business in oncology, and I started to like it. So that drove my transition then into a much smaller biotech company. Within biotech, it's still one of the largest biotech companies. And I spent 10 years and many product launches in that biotech company.
And I share your love of oncology. I mean, I think that's where we first met, in the oncology department of one of the large pharmas. And I just loved that we were helping people across the board. And oncology being very close to my heart, with my father passing away from his third cancer, shall we say. So thank you for all your hard work in that area. What function, department, or role do you currently serve, or do you serve?
So, I mean, when I left the industry about 5 years ago, right? And my last role there was I came back from a role as country manager for Australia and New Zealand in that biotech company, and then came back to a global role, which was focused actually across therapeutic areas, trying to figure out what a more effective and perhaps more efficient global organization looks like. So I stepped out of industry then in end of 2018 and built my own practice basically. And I do two things. I do some commercial consulting, and that's what we'll cover today. But I also do executive coaching with a particular focus on transitions from, the technical field into the people area, so often involving scientists or engineers, transitions from a big company to a small company or the other way around, and also geographic transitions. That's where I had my experiences, my learnings, particularly that expat community, to make sure they get off to a good start and can deliver pretty much the minute they touch ground in that new geography, Lynn.
And I do know what you mean with changing geography. Obviously, moving from the UK to the US was quite significant for me and the expat community, like you say, and then also assimilating into the geography. I'd been coming over to the US a couple of times a week, and so I was kind of used to the culture, but I do know what you mean. And helping companies, I think it's very valuable that you're helping individuals make the transitions, either, like you say, from small to big or big to small, or even into different areas.
It's very interesting in that, particularly that expat community, there's a lot of support from the company, but the majority of the support, as I also experience, is on the logistics, the family, and all those things are important, right? Because you don't have to worry about this. You focus on the business, but very few actually provide the support where it matters in that role, right? So you go from a global role into now you're the head of a country. There's things going on in your head. There's questions that you have about yourself, your capabilities, and addressing those early is very, very beneficial. And that's what I help companies with, to not address those questions as they unfold, but actually to anticipate them, to address them, to embrace them, so that the folks who are being sent to different geographies do not have to worry about their families and the logistics and the surroundings, but also are pretty confident in terms of being in the right role, in the right place with the right support, so they can ultimately deliver to the expectations that the company has.
Yeah, thank you. And you mentioned that feeling of, how do I have the right capabilities? And we'll address the whole mindset thing later on. We've got a question on that, but that's a great service to offer. I mean, having again recently moved from New Jersey to Atlanta, we found the same things. And although my company and I moved anyway, my husband found the same thing where he was actually going to a new job. So I totally understand how important it is for your role in that transition. So again, thank you. Let's
Thank
get
you.
back to
Yep.
product launch. What challenges do you see? What are the challenges to a successful product launch for either internal teams or external?
When I first heard that question a couple of days ago, I was thinking, well, how many pages do you want me to fill? But I think ultimately what it comes down is it's pretty much three things. I think those, to me, have been the most important ones when I was in it and also retrospectively reflecting on it. And that is, you have to manage expectations internally as well as externally. You have to manage things that you cannot control. And
Mhm.
in order to do both, I think what is most important, you have to manage yourself and stay very much true to yourself, self aware, and only then will you be able to manage the environment, the people, and the unknowns around you. So, in a little bit more detail, expectations, why are they challenging? Well, expectations are at times not based on reality. So there's tension, right? In terms of this is what you see, this is what expected. So you need to bring the two closer together. Easier said than done, because often that deals with the executive suite and there's a gap there. So that's a challenge to be managed. The non-controllables, it's many companies do talk about different scenarios, but when you look at the scenarios, most of them are in the positive space. So the one is optimal, the one is a little bit less optimal, the other one is, well, we would still launch. What they often do not look at in launch scenarios, they look at it often in business development, in the business development areas. What are the potential critical downsides, those black swan scenarios? Unlikely to happen, but if they do happen, the implications are devastating. So prepare for those. And those, you don't know what they are, right? You can make some assumptions by asking the right questions. So to me, those non-controllables are critical, and they're often overlooked because it's uncomfortable to talk about potential failures that you didn't trigger, but for the company, that is not seen as a success. Lastly, you're going to get pulled in many different directions. You have to sometimes tell or share unpleasant news to your superiors, but you have to stay true to yourself. And I think it is critical for the person who perhaps orchestrates a launch to have a little bit of a buffer to the team, to the subject matter experts, to the launch itself, so he or she can objectively look at what is going on, anticipate, assess, and then decide where we are, where we're going, and what needs to be done. So I think it starts with yourself, self-awareness, controlling yourself, being true to yourself. Only then, I think, can you manage the other two, prepare for the uncontrollables, but also manage expectations.
Yeah, those are three great ideas. I totally agree with you that managing yourself first and foremost is utmost. And then, as you say, expectations, because sometimes what you're being asked to do and what you actually can do, either the data doesn't say it, or there just isn't the capacity, there isn't market size, there isn't the market share that you can expect. And then the non-controllables. We did a scenario planning for one of our clients where the actual what if happened. And what happened then was they were able to take that strategy off the shelf and keep up and running rather than going back to the drawing board. And it was so important. And I know you and I have talked about this before, that those non-controllables can sneak up on you if you don't keep an eye on them. And it's not doom and gloom. It's just like, what could happen? What would we do if that happened? So the full scenario planning.
Exactly, because when you look at it, going a little bit to the internal versus external, the external world, whether that's the investors, whether that's the physician community, the healthcare professionals, or the patients, right? They trust the company, and they said, look, I mean, the company has been with this drug probably for the last 15 to 20 years since it was in preclinical. So they should know this drug inside out. They should know its mechanism of action. They should know what potential issues may come up, even though they have not seen them in phase 2 and 3, maybe because it's a controlled environment. So they trust them. So if something happens, the fact that something happens, that people can digest and say, okay, it wasn't seen, that's okay. What they cannot digest is if the company comes across as being unprepared for those scenarios, right? You have a little bit of time, but that honeymoon is very short before they ask questions, and you need to have answers. Hence, a little bit of an investment, just a few days in some of those unlikely scenarios pays off significantly when that actually happens. And what you have in your hands, the knowledge, how you come across to the external community, also to the internal community, is very different once you've prepared for those unlikely scenarios as part of your launch planning.
Absolutely. And it can mean those 3 or 4 days can mean whether you ended up spending another 3 or 4 days after the event has happened. If you do it before, then you can get up to speed very, very quickly and lose less time and be more efficient about what's happening and how you're dealing with the situation. And that can save patients' lives, but it can also save money for the day.
And internally, right, it builds confidence. Oh, we've considered that. This is great. It wasn't clear at the time, but we have a great team. They come together, handling and embracing something that is not anticipated, uncomfortable, but we're coming together. And it's also, again, from the external side, you gain trust. Mm-hmm. Because if everything goes well, many gaps are covered or hid because you just don't see them because you never have to address them. But if something unexpected happens, you see this in the car industry often, if a black swan, so an unexpected, potentially devastating event is handled extremely well, the perception and the reputation of the company actually increases because the way they've handled it.
Absolutely, yeah. And I've seen a couple of situations where something has been handled extremely well. And I remember writing or getting my team, should I say, to write letters after an incident had happened to explain what had happened and be very upfront and open about it and authentic about it from the company. And as you say, that goes a long way. The doctors, the key opinion leaders really value that honesty and authenticity. And then, like you say, back up to the shareholders and the external people who want to see that you've handled this properly. Awesome. So please, could you give examples of successful product launches? And as I said, we won't necessarily, it's up to you whether you use a product name or how far you go. Okay.
I mean, and then, some of the launches, so maybe I'll step back first and building on what we just discussed. I think one of the keys is a team shapes is actually to define and to agree with ultimately what is probably the executive board and then the board of directors. What does success look like? Because yes, there's sales expectations, yes, there's market share, but those are results of all the activities you will do pre-launch, launch, and that first 6 months, into launch. So defining what success looks like in that before market share and before, annual revenues is really critical. I think there's some basic scenarios. And I think to me, success is when the launch goes as planned, not significantly better, but also not significantly worse, meaning your prediction was spot on. There was nothing unexpected. This was great. Sometimes people say, well, but sales doubled. One could then start to question, well, if sales doubled, did you really have a good understanding of the customer perception, the resulting behavior, and your forecasting ability? Because if sales double, one could say that perhaps that is a weakness because it wasn't predicted the right way. So to me, it's success in the A scenarios as planned, not significantly worse, not significantly better, but within that comfort zone. And the one product that, speaking of oncology, that I've always admired, who's done this consistently over the years, was Avastin, right? Avastin has had product launch after product launch in different tumor types, for the most part, very successfully executed. The impact was successful, and also the way it was staggered. So always something new when before the plateau was reached. So I think Avastin is definitely a role model. Obviously, it's been a few years, but certainly a company and a performance that turned heads at the time. And when we both worked in oncology, that was one of the benchmarks, right? And I think to today, in many cases, it still is.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it was so powerful. And as you say, the amount of tumors that it actually covers and effectively is phenomenal. And the fact that it was staggered and laid out because they were collecting information all the time and moving into the next tumor. So it was an awesome lot.
So that was just finishing my thought. This is as planned, right? I think it's success should also be defined when it doesn't go as planned because there's something unexpected. The question then is, going back to the previous discussion or question, how do you manage something that was not part of the plan, right? An external event that was unforeseeable. And to me, one of the companies that did this extremely well was Biogen with Tysabri. Tysabri in the US was launched, very successful. I think it was one of the first 5, maybe 3 or 4 MS, multiple sclerosis drugs. And unexpected, there were brain infections, PML, cases of PML that were not seen earlier. And what happened then was that Biogen actually pulled the drug off the market. You see that often, but often it is imposed by the regulatory agency. In that case, my understanding is that Biogen decided to pull it. So that's one move. But then, interestingly, they looked at what happened. They understood their data. They provided the right guidance and protection, and they actually relaunched the product with FDA guidance and everything. And my understanding is, in the history of FDA, a product being pulled and a product being relaunched, I think there's less than 5 drugs. And Tysabri did extremely well in terms of helping patients. There's fewer physicians that were comfortable with it because the risk you had mentioned, but nevertheless, I think it's a rare case where something unexpected happened and the company responded extremely well, so much so that they were able to relaunch and perhaps a little bit beyond the original expectations. But nevertheless, if you look at the numbers, Tysabri over the years exceeded $1 billion in sales, if not 2, for almost a decade.
Tremendous amount of patients with MS. So yeah, I can see why that would be one that you would choose. How do you define a suboptimal launch?
Yeah, so again, the definition is important. I'm glad you're asking, How do you define it? So to me, that would be when you can anticipate a challenge, right? But you're not handling it the right way, right? You make a wrong decision, you have a wrong assumption, and basically when expected challenges are not successfully addressed. And unfortunately, that was the case most recently with the same company, with Biogen, with Aduhelm, with the Alzheimer's product. Specifically, so this combination that led to the challenge with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or the reimbursement of the with the elderly in that system, was this the data itself, how it was presented, and also how the drug was priced, without going into the details, because Biogen months later cut the price significantly, and so they saw what they originally assumed was probably not based on the right data, not the right assumption. And I would think it could have been a better launch had that perhaps been handled a different way, right? Maybe a little bit more scenario planning and anticipating this a little bit more, because it was clearly that the patient population, I think 2/3, are either in Medicare or Medicaid. So the government will be the one that reimburses them. So this is your biggest customer. I mean, thank God for the company to now have a second Alzheimer's product. As you know, the data is much, much clearer, much more succinct. And hopefully for all the patients out there, their families, and also for Biogen, the second one will be launched the right way so that ultimately the patients will benefit in what is a devastating disease state.
Yeah, and I know there are a lot of companies who are trying to combat this awful disease,
Yeah.
but at the moment it's just a case of managing, isn't it? So, the more products we can have to give patients that little bit extra. Awesome, thank you. Could you possibly give examples of products that were not so successful as they perhaps could have been, and what you might have think attributed to their success or failure?
Sometimes it's difficult to understand what some of the underlying causes are, right? But when you just go back to the one that's been very much in the public recently, I think in fact is Aduhelm, right? This the Biogen drug, and I think there you have some pricing is always sensitive with every company. We know that, given the system, particularly in the US. The data, obviously, in terms of the results, that was known, right? Those were presented, the New England Journal, it was published. So then this discrepancy came out with the data was interpreted in different ways, but the data is the data.
Mhm.
All of a sudden, you look at the FDA, and the label was very broad, much to the surprise of many people, right? And then Biogen based their pricing, as they stated, based on the label given by the FDA. And as we all know, many of the FDA advisors thought that label was too broad. It does not reflect the data. So I think there was a sense of perhaps a little bit of wishful thinking or being overly positive, and it came crashing down, right? Because ultimately, the only thing you know for sure and what you can hang your hats on is the data that you have. And if the data is somewhat limited, to me, that is your platform, that is your assumption. Don't try to polish it. Present it as it is, because that way you continue to have credibility. You have more Alzheimer's drugs coming out anyway. So I think that was one of the cases where, unfortunately, a lot of things did not go the way they could have gone based on some of the decisions that were made at the company. And therefore, I would put that into the, what did we call it? Yeah, suboptimal, exactly, the suboptimal launches. Clearly, I mean, we don't have to go into the sales numbers, but it's unfortunately been tagged as one of the rather learnings rather than successful launches, right? In terms of what to pay attention to as you prepare for product launch.
And that's an important point, the learnings. This is why we're doing this podcast, is to help other people maybe coming into product management or medical affairs, to understand what actually did happen, so we can try and avoid it in the future,
Yeah.
some of these pitfalls.
Going back to what you asked in the beginning, for whoever is the individual or the perhaps 5 or 6 people who are that core launch team, a lot of it depends on how they're set up within the company and whatnot, and how empowered they are. But ultimately, they are the ones, right, that much of it is with them, and they need to have the patient in mind, obviously have the company in mind, but ultimately stick to the facts and drive the company, drive the executives to visit some of these uncomfortable spaces, right? What if this happens? What if that happens? Because if everything goes well, nobody's going to tag you for spending time there.
Mhm.
But if everything goes, south, as they say, and you have prepared, guess who's going to be, fingers are going to be pointed at that team. Why didn't we do this? So I think that is one of the key things, the courage to
Mhm.
explore negative scenarios and don't get caught up with the Kool-Aid when everyone is very happy about what they saw in phase 2, in phase 3. Because now it goes out to the real world. Patients are no longer hospitalized, they're not in the doctor's office, life gets in the way, and things happen, and all of a sudden you see a different product profile. You need to plan for that. And
Yeah.
hopefully you will never have to execute that plan B or C, but you can be assured or you can be comfortable if it does happen, at least we have the start of a plan. So we are prepared, we have the confidence, and patients and physicians, they can trust us because we thought about those things.
Mm. Yeah. Taking that extra little time.
Yeah.
What metrics do you prefer to use to measure success, or what have you used?
I would say it starts with basic, right? It's sort of like, did you do what you said you were going to do, and what was the impact of it? Obviously, you did all the research in terms of this message is the right message a year prior to launch. You tweak it a little bit depending on the label, but ultimately, that's all in the planning phase. Now you see the real world impact of all your plans. So to me, it starts with the execution, right? Did you do what you said you were going to do? Was it a share of voice, whatever it is? Did you action it the way we thought and we decided it was going to be action? That's one. So basically, were you efficient? Did you do the right? Did you do the right way?
Mm.
But then, secondly, now that you're in the real world, does it have the impact that we thought it was going to have? So, is it effective, right, according to what we're anticipating? To me, those are the two key ones. They probably apply to most commercial or medical areas. You can apply those two types of indicators on qualitative measures such as perception, on quantitative such as market share and whatnot. But I think what's also important is to get the data as early as possible, right? And even if it's a small sample, even if it's what the pharmacist says, right? That's usually an early indicator. Even what the wholesaler says, here's the questions that I get from the pharmacist. Those are all early lead indicators in terms of, are those the questions you expected?
Mhm.
Are those new questions you didn't expect? And you got to consider at least reviewing the strategy, see if you're still on track. So I think, did you do what you said you were going to? Is the impact right? And do this as early as possible. That to me would be sort of like the guardrails as you prepare for what are the metrics, 6 months before, 6 months, not even 6 months, but you can collect those wholesalers on a weekly, on a daily basis, right? Those are the things that should be considered. Some people say then, well, they're small samples, how representative they are they true? But what is the alternative? Do you want to wait 8 weeks until you have the IMS data? Once you have the share data, it is very difficult because 2 months or 6 weeks have passed
Mhm.
before you can actually put a strategy together. That's another 4 weeks. All of a sudden, you're 3 months into the market, and
Mhm.
perceptions, as we all know, shape in those first 6 months.
Mhm.
So if the trajectory is wrong or not as anticipated, you will know that as soon as possible. You can always decide, no, this is an outlier. That's fine, but at least you have a heads up that something looks funky at a nice and early stage, giving you time to look at it and to potentially respond to the observation.
Mm. Yeah, and gathering those insights is just so key, like you say, from the field to bring
That
that, because you don't know, you're not out there, but the field staff or the field team who are hearing these conversations, seeing these conversations, having these conversations, should I say, are really the ones who are getting seeing the trends, and it's those trends that are important, isn't it? When you're pulling it all together, it's the trend. What? Okay, it's small samples, but small sample here, small sample there, small sample there. Oh, there's a trend going on. let's have a look at that trend and see what's happening there.
Very good. And I'm glad you extended this a little bit, because it's obviously not just the external resources, but you have your personnel in the field with your clients, whether it's the MSLs, whether it's the reimbursement folks talking to insurers, whether it's the reps, right? Detailing doctors. Those are the ones, hands-on experience. It's an easy feedback loop, right? And that all needs to be established before you launch. And then, yeah, small sample, but if there's a trend in terms of it's the same theme in 4 out of 6, it's probably more than a trend, right? You might want to look into this. So thank you for adding on to what I mentioned earlier.
What functions do you think are a priority for a successful launch, and why?
Sometimes there's a little bit of, having spent time in big pharma and in biotech, there's definitely different dynamics in terms of roles and responsibilities when it comes to that. But I think across the board, you should have the right functions at the right time, being either accountable, responsible, the RACI, right? Being consulted or being informed. But I think just as importantly are the people in those functions who are on that team, right? And I think when you look at the people, it certainly helps. Mindset comes, no pun intended, comes to mind again. When you go into or before phase 3, you can say that's a little bit early. Yeah, but many of the launch facts that you're dealing with are actually collected in phase 3, right? So this principle of starting with the end in mind plays a big role in pharma, right? So the folks who are with physicians, MSLs, appropriately, right? Not sales reps, because it's not approved yet, but MSLs, market research, have that input very early and bring this into the launch team, because that informs a lot of things early on that will set the trajectory, right? So that's one thing. People who have ultimately the experience how things play out 6, 12, 18 months down the road, you need those to a reasonable extent early on to inform certain decisions. They may not make the decision, because often you go in phase 3 is still R&D, that's okay, but those things need to be considered. That's one thing. I think the second thing that I've seen is the teams that work well are the teams or the individuals that can work together as a team. They have common goals, all of that. But it goes back to the individual, right? And is he or she, are they a subject matter experts, or they only talk about, for instance, market access and pricing? That's their only responsibility. That's fine if that is what you need. But in that core launch team where you probably have, medical, commercial, regulatory, maybe legal, I think what is extremely important there is not to be a subject matter expert only, but 50% of your responsibility, yes, is your line function. So you are representing, for instance, regulatory, FDA considerations and all of that. But the other 50% is you are a member of a launch team. So you are just as much in charge of the overall launch. So the other 50% of you are the general manager of this brand. So if you hear something from the commercial person, from a legal person, that triggers another thought, or that you say, this could be a red flag, you have the responsibility to speak up. And I think that culture where people can not question things, but ask questions, point things out, and everyone says, it's all about the brand and it's all about the product. It's not about us individually. That culture goes a long way, because people are comfortable to raise flags, even with little things, because as based on the previous questions that we have, those little things can turn into major challenges 12 months down the road. So I think that is the key thing. So yes, there's the right functions, a little bit more R&D driven early on, phase 2, phase 3. And for instance, in pharma, it's often commercial taken over, overall responsibility. Phase 3 biotech, it is still R&D. I think if you have the right people with the right mindset, the structure doesn't really matter, as long as they know what their overall responsibility is and what their individual mindset is, that it's not just about them. There's few of them, but they have a bigger responsibility to make the brand successful, not to only make their function successful.
Yeah, I loved your statement about it's all about the brand and it's not about the individual. And, we were in a workshop where it was very early on where we were getting regulatory involved. And there was a little bit of, this is my information, I'm keeping it here close to my chest, until everybody started to really just think about the brand. And then the conversations started. And it was a case of what can we put in the label? What can't we put in the label? How do we say it? What's the best way to use the terminology? And then everybody was working together, and it was a great succession to see. But you're totally right in terms of the mindset of that individual and then the mindset of the team. And it's all about the brand. So I love that.
I think if I may, just one final thought there. As individuals, whether you're the launch team leader or whether you're the lead regulatory representative, I think, again, going back to one of the earlier themes, self-awareness in terms of knowing what you really understand 100% and knowing your blind spots in terms of that's my weaker aspect, that goes a long way to what you see at times, particularly in biotech, is people are being hired for a launch, and that's good, people with experience. But when you then, look at the details or the detailed background, often what you see is a 50-50. So let's say the head of regulatory for a big brand in pharma is hired into a small biotech company or a smaller biotech company. All of a sudden, she or he become the launch lead because they have done so many launches when in fact they've represented regulatory for 50%, they've represented overall, yes, 50%, but they've never had the real launch experience, like a single person, or maybe it's a combined role, R&D and commercial. So I think in an extreme way, the subject matter expert in big pharma will not by default be the launch expert in biopharma. That is you see that commonly. So that is one thing I think where the individual has to really say, hey, look, this is what I know. Here's the areas that I'm very familiar with, and here's where I need help. Right? Again, self-awareness, very, very important, because you can't just plug and play, but there needs to be a good understanding in terms of how do we help each other so that nothing falls through the cracks because nobody has the experience or somebody doesn't speak up.
Yeah, and you raise a really good point, because we work with medical affairs directors who have just done that, come from a big pharma often, where they've been part of a team, and then they are totally responsible for this product launch. And that's where people like you and I come in, where we can coach that person to do that product launch and work with them, because we want them to succeed as part of the team. And we also, like you said, the blind spots or the blinkers that they haven't seen something. As an outsider, as an outside consultant, you and my team can really sort of hone in on those blind spots, because we're not steeped in it. We're not trying to manage the data and the publications and everything going on. We can see it from a top line view and see what some of the potential blind spots and mishaps are, and also guide and coach that person so that they become better. And then they've done a launch, or they've done a couple of launches, and now they are the expert in product launch at that small or mid-sized pharma or biotech.
Yeah, again, it's very difficult because ultimately in that scenario, right, you take the analog of a builder and all of a sudden now you're the architect, right? It's a different trade, right? You need to learn different things. And once you have that role of an architect, those are the expectations. It's very difficult to stay real and to basically say, okay, here's my areas of strength. Here's what I need to learn. I'm going to share that with the team. The word vulnerability comes to mind, right? Which is one of the strongest things, one of the strongest attributes a person can bring to a team, because you open up, people will always help you. It's not a question, but you need to open up first. And this is a very difficult thing if you go in with come in with high expectations and management. You got to have all the answers. No, nobody has all the answers. It's the person who invites questions with the right team that will get the answer that makes this possible. But that takes a lot of self-awareness and being able to step outside and look at, as you say, a consultant can do it much more effectively. Some team leaders do it extremely well, but there are very few of them who can step out and look at the team from the outside as a consultant and say, oh, including themselves, I need to do this better. I think we're missing out on here, and then step back into the role, right, into character, and do these things. But it's an important function, because this is, as you know, it's not a 3 months period. This is 2 years, 3 years, depending on the company. where this team is together and transitions and information goes away because people change. So it's very critical to be transparent, be open with each other so that the knowledge stays there and grows and different perspectives are heard and gaps
Mm.
are openly discussed, right? And then filled basically as you move forward.
Yeah. And that leads us nicely actually into the next question. How do you think the team's and individual's mindset plays a part in launch success? I know you partially answered it, but
Yeah, I think I can step it one step up in terms of the mindset is critical because the mindset ultimately drives behaviors, right? So how you think is how you act. It's very consistent, right? That's usually if you have a functional person, there's three things that need to come together: the thoughts, how they feel about it, and the behaviors. Those are the three things. And many folks, if the thought is right and they know the behaviors, the emotions, they fall into place. But it all starts with how you look at it and how you think about it, because that drives your action. So I think mindset is really important. And again, that core team, they should be very clear in terms of this is how we look at this, and looking equals how we think about this. And therefore, here's our responsibilities, and this is what we do. Because ultimately, it's if that is agreed to in the beginning with intent, it creates the platform not only for this team but as members for their culture. So as members change, the culture shouldn't change. If the leader change, culture shouldn't change because the culture has been adapted by the team, and that's all a matter of aligning mindsets.
mm-hmm, absolutely. And I'd like to add one step before their thoughts in that the beliefs. So what you believe about yourself and about the
Yeah.
situation then plays a big part into your thoughts and then your emotions and your behaviors. So yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
It's such a critical part, but a lot of people don't want to necessarily acknowledge that it's the I'm not broken syndrome, but you're not broken at all. You're a highly functioning person. There's just some things that you might have a preconceived idea or a
Exactly.
perception about that's going to change the way you look at things. So,
Coming into those teams, maybe, oh, I have experience here and I've experience there. Well, that's nice, but ultimately, experience can easily turn into baggage if you don't know whether that's relevant, how to apply it, is it appropriate for the situation, does it conflict with someone else? So all these things, I think, as the team shapes in the beginning, it is time extremely well spent to talk these things through before you actually go into action. Because usually, if everything goes well, you're like, why do we talk about this? This is all this fluffy stuff. Yes, yes, yes. But once you hit a roadblock, you will notice that had we only spent time on the fluffy stuff, because then there wouldn't have been any reactions, there would have been responses. We knew as a team that, okay, we said, if this happens, here's how we're going to handle this. And you would have a plan B, which goes back again to this is something that actually is likely to happen. So just handle it early on, set the standards, agree to the rules, revisit every once in a while. So when the time comes, not caught off guard, you know exactly what you have to do as a team.
okay. What strategy and planning tools do you think can be used by teams to increase their efficiency while executing a product launch?
That's a funny question because preparing for this, I think I've been involved in probably 15 or 20 launches in different roles and everything. And I would argue, let's just say it's 15, we probably used 20 different programs, right? Because even within the same company, there was not one launch tool. And if there was, guess what? It changed the next year. So, in my opinion, we always had on the core team a program or a project manager, right? That kept track of everything. Leave it up to them. Whatever they are comfortable with, as long as their approach, the tools that they use, meet the team's needs in terms of can this thing churn out a presentation to the CEO or whatnot, that's fine because ultimately they need to be comfortable with it. I don't think there's a perfect system. If you have the right people, I think that's the first step. And then whoever needs to harness all the information and needs to come up, with the flow charts, let that person decide in terms of what he or she is most comfortable with on the one side. But hopefully that system can also address some of the, functional needs in terms of updates and the, traffic light slides and all those things. So I don't think there's a single solution. I think one of the best solutions is to, here's what we need, let the program manager decide on that.
Full disclosure, I had an ulterior motive for that because we actually developed a product launch software tool because what was happening as we were helping some of our clients with the product launch process, the strategy, building the strategy, and then setting up the implementation plan, we were actually given lots of Excel sheets, and then there was a presentation here and a presentation there, and somebody had it on that computer and somebody had it over there, and then it was still on SharePoint. And so one of the things I did with one of my partners was actually build a tool to house all of that. And I don't want to make the podcast about that, but there was an ulterior motive in that. But it's interesting to hear your response about the project manager and let them decide.
And that's the second point that I mentioned. You said it much nicer in terms of it needs to have a home where everything is in, right? Because otherwise, I mean, some of the companies I worked for, yeah, we had a financial forecasting tool, but guess what everyone showed up with? I mean, we're talking billions of dollars. They all have their own Excel spreadsheet. How can that be in a company with 100,000 employees? But that's the reality, right? And often it's, to your point, the functionality to say, well, that program is good, but it serves commercial, not medical, not finance. So if you have that house where everything fits, that's certainly good for you, because that is something that I personally never saw, never found.
Well, maybe I'll show you it another time. But
Yeah, let's do that.
what trends have you seen in the industry over the last 3 years? And 3 years being important because of what's happened economically and environmentally, shall we say?
Yeah, I think the let's just say perhaps that, COVID, we can talk a long time for that. I would say COVID is one of those things that it's probably a black swan scenario. So if there's a COVID specific case, right, I think that falls into highly unlikely, but if it happened, what would we do? So I think a COVID-like scenario, whatever that may look like, God forbid in the future, maybe that's a standard scenario from now on moving forward, because you no longer have reps going out. So how do you do this?
Mm-hmm.
Which brings me to the second one. So I look at it from a perspective also, particularly in the last 3 to 5, digital and then artificial intelligence. Right? There's a lot of pros, there's a lot of cons. What I look at this when I look at these things is they can really help me out probably with the predictability of certain things to happen, right? So I'm not a technician or an AI person, but if I feed into that quote unquote machine all the data, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, if that brain, artificial brain, could spit out different scenarios, events that are unlikely, but if they do happen, are brutal, that's great, right? Because that way, here's a menu. The team still needs to decide in terms of why and which ones, but I think that saves you a lot of time and it increases the awareness and the need to do the scenario planning, right? Funny, maybe some people trust machines more spitting out these things than people talking about it, but I think that will be helpful in terms of the predictability of certain events. That's one. Two, I think, is the speed, right? I think if you have, I mean, I think there's 2 or 3 FDA approved treatments now with a phase 3 was done with patient records, right? So not a real patient, it was all patient records. So those type of things, I think even pre-launch, is where digital and AI can have a significant role, right? Post-launch, and also taking in adverse events, treatment efficacy, what's the impact on all those parameters. Speaking of early indicators, they can be fed back, right, much earlier to the company, and the company has to report them to the FDA to give you a sense of how you're trending, particularly those first 6 months, right? And I think, lastly, there's certainly also some cost savings involved there, right? And I wouldn't sacrifice cost for quality, because you're dealing with patient lives ultimately. But I think there's probably some spaces where digital and artificial intelligence can also reduce the cost, freeing up money and putting money somewhere else, patient services, new indications, more money into oncology, for instance. So I see those as the 3 benefits. But at the same time, again, I think there's a time and a place for all of these things. And I think it depends on the therapeutic area. setting that the patients and the disease itself. So I wouldn't sort of like spread these out evenly across all and say you all need to do this. I would rather think about them. Here's the utility of all these things. You tell me where and why you could benefit from those tools as a launch team in a certain function that contributes to the launch. So that's how I would look at it. And ultimately, you're talking illnesses, you're talking patients in need, right? I don't think that's a belief. You mentioned about thinking and beliefs. I personally do not believe that AI can replace a physician or a nurse because there's such a big emotional component that maybe at some point in the future, a machine can do this. I just don't see it currently and probably not in the foreseeable future. But this true patient care, particularly the nurses, I hope that the machinery advances, right, to some extent, but I hope it does it at the right speed and that it's really based on specific situations, based on patient needs ultimately, right?
Yeah, it was funny. I did a poll on LinkedIn about what people thought about AI in general, and one of the answers was it can be important, but let's take it carefully. I totally echo what you've just said, because that was where I was sitting. Yes, I can see the utility and in certain places, but we need to be just a little bit careful and let's grow with it gently, not rush out.
I would agree. Yeah.
What do you think needs to be done to increase launch success going forward? And that's $1 million question.
I thought about, again, this is one where how many pages do you want? I think it all starts with, do you provide value as a pharmaceutical provider? So if whatever it is that you're producing, whether it's a medical device or whether it's a treatment, if it addresses a true medical need, I think that's the first step, right? Medication taken 2 times a day, 3 times a day, that's not something important. We know that from data. There's no difference between once a day or twice a day in patient compliance. So those don't produce value. And I would even advocate, but that's a personal belief, that people may want to take a look at, some of the diseases are lifestyle driven, right? And do those need to be reimbursed? That's a question, right? Or do you want to incentivize patients with this? And it's difficult because it's behavioral change, right? A little bit earlier so it never gets to that disease, right? And some of them you can't control, but many diseases are lifestyle driven, right? So that's one question. But I'd say it starts with addressing a true medical need, and nice to haves are not adding value to patients, companies, to investors, and to the system, right? That is not so. I would say companies do take a hard look. Is this really something where we can pass the red face test early in the morning that yes, this is truly an innovation, yes or no? So I think that's one. And that's always been the case, one could say, but as more and more of these, okay, so this is once a day versus 3 times a day, maybe it's time to go back a little bit and say, does this truly advance medicine and help the disease, or is this more convenient? So that's one. I think the second one, which is perhaps the just as important, is to understand and maybe to go in with the goal of improving the marketplace and the system that you're launching into, right? If you look, for instance, at the US, still the largest market, there's a lot of challenges, right? It's very segmented, it's not transparent. You go to the hospital, they give you one price, you get bills from the laboratory that never were addressed earlier. So it's very confusing at times, and it's at times very inefficient, right? And access is an issue, right? There's many people who do not have access to medicine. The flip side is it's one of the systems where the majority of, I would argue, valuable innovations come from the US or from US companies, right? Oncology drugs. So you got to be able to juggle both. And to me, one of the things is truly you want to challenge this the distribution net, right? In terms of how you go into this through the wholesaler, then a regional wholesaler, to the PBM and all this. And there are efforts, right? So there was an effort, Haven, which was JP Morgan Amazon and Buffett, that fell apart, but you can read up on it. It's not for reasons of it didn't work, but different reasons. In fact, they do it now individually. I think those go-to-market innovators, interestingly, they're not pharma, right? No. They are external folks. I think talking to them and collaborating with them would be a major step forward to address some of the inefficiencies in the US system. I truly believe in that. I mean, Amazon, for instance, is one of them who, when you talk to them with the rep, it's not territory based. They bought dating companies for the technology so they can match up the right customer based on his geography, based on the socioeconomic status, based on the voice, with the right rep. So it's really interesting how they do. So to me, that's the type of thinking that should go into launches moving forward. Do we want to do this traditional way? Or do we just want to do, you have, the Viagra generics, television. All you got to do is go on the internet. There's a doctor there. Boom, it's all done. Takes less than 10 minutes. Here you go. I think that is something that I would love to see, because the more efficient you are, the more resources become available. It gets a little bit cheaper. And hopefully medications come to the market quicker so that the patient benefit is quicker. So that's the second one. But ultimately, between those two, I think it comes back to the people who are in charge of that launch, right? In terms of being real, going back to the very first discussion point, what are realistic expectations here, internally as well as externally? What are some of the things that we just don't see, but because you cannot forecast the unpredictable, right? It's logical that you cannot do this, but you can prepare for that. You can prepare for that with different scenarios. So at least you're one step ahead should it happen. Because think about it, if a product fails, right, Tysabri PML at the time, one thing is the revenues, yes, of course, but imagine the number of patients that had hoped for this product and all of a sudden it's no longer available. I mean, there is entire patient lives not destroyed, but they lose hope. And when you have a disease that is difficult to treat, in oncology, in particular cancer, hope is the thing that keeps you alive. When hope goes, everything goes. So I think it comes down to the people there, in terms of between the launching the right drug that really provides value into a system where maybe the pharma company working together with some of these innovators from a system perspective, Amazon, others, maybe that's an expanded responsibility, value that pharma can create. Ultimately, to make those two happen, it comes down to the people and to the companies. Companies are ultimately people. Executives, the launch team, really closely working with the executives to be real in terms of what the expectations are, to, I think, have perhaps a little bit more of a humanitarian perspective on these things, right? In terms of patient benefit, having grown up in a system where the government pays for healthcare and the life expectancy is actually higher than in the US. It makes you think, right? Is there a better way of doing it? It probably is, but you need to embrace it. So it's those two, the people working with the right people and being real. And if all of that is set up, planning for the what if scenarios, right? I think it's devastating if something happens where you say you could have planned for this. Devastating, major impact obviously on revenues, but that's, I would think, is secondary. Imagine the impact that has on patients. If you have a life-saving drug and now something happens and you got to pull it off the shelves for one reason or another because you were not prepared for something that you could have prepared for, patients are devastated. They lose hope. And hope at times is the only thing that keeps them alive, not the drug, but the hope for the drug. Now you're taking that away from them. So in my perfect scenario, those are the right people with the right mindset, and mixing up a little bit in terms of the marketplace, but ultimately doing the right thing by launching a drug that truly provides values to all stakeholders.
Yeah, and that's a really good sort of ending thought. Having grown up in the UK and having the government pay for the healthcare, and having seen how it treated my parents, and very well, I can say that when I first came to the US, I could not get my head around it, and I probably still can't. There's a lot of inefficiencies, but I have to be careful what I share, because I was talking to a company last night, and they are trying to change the paradigm of healthcare, just as you were talking about, access to patients of these much needed products more direct. So, and it's still they haven't properly launched yet. So, but it's a good point. Thank you so much, Joerg. This has given us a lot of food for thought, and we could have probably talked all day. I love talking to you, and we love sort of sharing ideas, and I think that's a good thing. So we discussed what our experts deem crucial for a successful product launch, and we wanted to provide podcast participants with ideas to stimulate their thinking and identify potential innovations that would help move the industry forward. And I think you've come up with some great ideas. We hope that you gained insights and enjoyed the podcast. Feel free to share your thoughts, and please contact me with any questions or suggestions at lynn@connectorstrategy.com, and it would be our pleasure to hear from you. And if at any point you wanted to contact any of our speakers, we can arrange that. So thank you very much for all your time. I really appreciate it. Joerg?
My pleasure. Thank you. It was a great pleasure also sharing some of my experience. I think to me and to you, having both seen many product launches, there's obviously the 1, 2, 3 basics that these are the things you have to do, but there's all these nuances, and hopefully we touched on some of them. They may not be applicable for you, but as we said, you need to look for things that you cannot predict, cannot anticipate, and hopefully we brought some to the table today that you may want to consider for your local product launches, for which I wish you all the best, much luck, and do some scenario planning. It helps. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being my honoured guest, and I apologise for the technical difficulties. I think there's a gremlin appeared in my computer.
We all deal with those gremlins, right?
Yeah.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. There's a lot more great information to come, so be sure to subscribe and stay tuned as we continue in this series. If you enjoyed the podcast today, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. For more information, see our website, www.connectastrategy.com. That's www.connectastrategy.com. Or follow us on Facebook or LinkedIn.